Introducing Mike Sussman from BAV. Mike has been the brainchild behind the Best Country Studies for many years, and there's nobody better to put the Best Country Study into context. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, David. We're really excited about the launch of the 2021 Best Countries study. It's the most comprehensive study of the power of nation brands. We've been doing this for 6 years, covering countries that represent 95% of the global GDP and about 75% of the world's population. So an amazing coverage. This year, we're looking at 78 countries. We spoke to over 17,000 business decision makers, citizens, and elites around the world. And we've ranked countries on a battery of metrics, including 26 key rankings that we'll talk about throughout this report and throughout the app. One thing we've seen over time is the shifting impact of soft power. It's becoming more and more important to driving the power of a country, while hard power, like banks and tanks, as we call it, the more traditional power, is becoming less impactful on the success of a nation. When we think about the power of a nation, we think about 10 key dimensions, and you can look at each of these ranks and how a country does on these things, from entrepreneurship to cultural influence to quality of life. We've introduced 2 new ones that are becoming more and more important today in these changing dynamics of culture. One of those is how socially purposeful is a nation. And the second is how agile is a nation, how responsive it is to things, particularly during a COVID era. And both of those dimensions are extremely important in driving the GDP and the success of a nation. Agile nations are seen as 3 times more likely to be a better job market. They're rated 3.2 times more likely as being economically influential. They are more connected to the rest of the world. So agile nations are doing something to resonate with people globally. Really important to mention, and it's the biggest driver now of GDP. And that's something that the nations need to be more and more of today. So when you think about agility, the top nations around the world this year are USA, number 1 in terms of being an agile country, followed by Australia, and in 3rd place is Canada. We continue to see the rising power of purpose, not just for brands, but also for nations. In fact, purposeful nations are 57% more likely to be considered for tourism, 55% more likely to be considered as a place to do business. So it's important to be seen as a purposeful and socially responsible country. Number 1 on this purposeful dimension is Canada, followed by Denmark, and 3rd place is New Zealand out of 78. So pretty impressive, pretty strong dimensions, very important. We also see the power and impact of brands that resonate from countries. In fact, 79.5% of citizens say that consumer brands play an important role in defining a country's culture. So there's a strong relationship between the brands and the nation. We also see that 78.6% of citizens say that the country a product is made in impacts their preference for a brand. So you can see that interplay between brand and country and how important it is today. And we started measuring the power of what does it mean to be made in a specific country. What does made in America mean, or made in China? And we can rank the power of these nations in terms of their exports. So, for instance, Germany ranks number 1 in terms of the country you'd want to buy an automobile from. They also dominate on pharmaceuticals and beer. So you can see a little bit of a balanced power of that nation. Italy is number 1 on fashion. So that's the top brand for when you're thinking about buying fashion brands. France owns cosmetics. In terms of the best countries for real estate, Canada ranks number 1, followed by the United States and then France. So overall, again, you can see how the building blocks of a nation affect its overall ranking. And we're excited to share some more details with you. Back to you, David.
Well, now it's time to get an overview of the key insights from the 2021 study on a global perspective. And who better to do that for us than Professor David Ribstein from Wharton University. Professor Ribstein has been our partner in this study since it started, and his unique understanding and unique perspective of countries, of brands, and what's driving GDP growth is unrivaled. So let's hear from David now.
Hello, I'm Dave Ribstein. I'm a marketing professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. I've been involved with the Best Country Study since its inception. This year has been a different year. It's been a transformational year. There's been many things that have affected how we view countries and how we live our particular lives. First and foremost, obviously, we've had to deal with the COVID-19. and the tragic loss of millions of lives all around the world. Accompanying this has been the huge impact on economies of various different countries, leading to an overall global recession. Some countries have handled the pandemic well, such as South Korea and Taiwan and several others, whereas other countries have not handled it nearly as well. Accompanying this pandemic has been the subsequent vaccine distribution. And this has required acquisition of vaccines as well as some form of equitable distribution of those. Perhaps Israel has been the country that has done the best at it. There are others that are catching up, but there are other countries that are still struggling today with trying to manage the vaccine distribution. A third major thing that's been happening this year has been the Black Lives movement that originated in the United States and has found it in various other countries all around the world. Climate impact has been a major event that's happened in various different countries. Perhaps most notable are the brush fires that happened in Australia. We've seen other events, such as the explosions that happened in the Beirut port, killing millions of lives. And of course, we could not ignore Brexit and the impact that's had on the British economy, as well as the economies of Europe. Many, many events have made this year an exceptional year. And it's part of what it is that we've all had to adjust to. Perhaps the greatest impact, of course, has been the pandemic. And what we have witnessed as individuals is we see that how we buy and where we shop, that's changed. How we work, many of us working from home, some of us not having jobs. So there's been a dramatic impact for individuals, where we eat and how we interact with family and friends, dramatically affected, and we've had to adapt. Businesses have had to adapt as well. And what they have had to do is how they connect with their customers has changed. Meetings have changed. The ability to have trade shows dramatically affected. The whole supply chain has been disrupted. And certain industries, such as the hospitality industries or the airline industry, have been dramatically affected, with sporting events being canceled throughout the world. So many industries have suffered as a result. And when I've talked to business leaders, almost inevitably, what it is that they tell me is they've needed to be agile. And it sort of is the buzzword that I hear from companies. But that's not restricted to just individuals and companies. Countries have had to adapt as well. And what it is that we have seen is we see, obviously, trying to get the healthcare systems up to speed and handling with this medical crisis that we've got. And getting medical supplies to the hospitals and to individuals has also been an issue. But trying to cope with the unemployment levels and trying to deal with that and supporting the local governments has been a major issue for countries all around the world. And what countries have had to do they've had to adapt as well. Well, we too at the Best Country Study have had to go through our own adaptations. We've added 13 new attributes that we use for evaluating countries. And we have taken one of the previous dimensions, that of citizenship, and we have morphed it into a dimension that we call social purpose. And what is social purpose? It has many of the dimensions that we had in citizenship, but it also includes dimensions such as human rights and racial equality and social justice and climate concern. That have all been attributes that now feed into the social purpose dimension. And we've added a new dimension. And this new dimension, this new overall factor is one of course, agility. And what is it that we have feeding into agility? Our perceptions of countries in terms of their adaptability and in terms of responsiveness and how progressive they are and how modern they happen to be and how dynamic they are all feed into this agility dimension. So with that said, let's take a look at the latest rankings that we have.
We'll unmute. I'll unmute and I'll stay out. I'll come off. Hello from Dublin. I'm JP Donnelly, who is country manager of WPP in Ireland. We're delighted to be part of the 24 countries that are working in this 24-hour countdown of the BAV WPP Best Country Study. Today is the beginning of a very important conversation, one that we hope we will continue to have with WPP and BAV. And it's great to see that Ireland comes in ranked 23rd out of the 78 countries that have emerged in the study, which shows once again we punch well above our weight when it comes to marketing communication. Why do we do that is something that we're going to discuss in our panel. And we've got a bunch of very special guests with us today, including my colleague Jane Gregory, who's the Managing Director of Ogilvy Dublin. We have Dr. John Fanning, who is former chairman of the legendary McConnell's Advertising and also a fountain of all great knowledge in advertising, and more importantly, an author of some distinguished papers, academic papers in the area of nation branding. And finally, we have perhaps our best brand ambassador for our country and indeed brand manager, our central marketing director for Tourism Ireland, Mr. Mark Henry. Before we start that conversation, we're going to kick off with a few words of context from John Fanning.
Thank you, JP. The first thing I'd like to say is that I think the concept of the nation brand is extremely important, and it's probably more important for countries like Ireland, for smaller countries, than it would be for bigger countries, because we have to make a bigger impact on the world. My thesis, if you like, which is not scientifically proven or even academically proven, is that the Irish brand image dates from the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, and was constructed with a certain amount of deliberation by a group of intellectuals about that time. Now, Ireland at the end of the 19th century was in a very bad shape. We were still a colonized nation. The famine was in recent memory. A huge proportion of the population had emigrated. Economically, we were not very successful. And also a factor that's sometimes neglected. We had given up our language. And if countries do that, they suffer enormous loss of self-confidence. So at the end of the 19th century, a group of intellectuals, mainly writers, got together and decided to do something about it and to construct a new Irish identity. Next slide. And there's some of those writers, and in the center is W.B. Yeats, who was the acknowledged and writers tend not to acknowledge each other. They tend to be quite bitchy as a rule, but I think he was the acknowledged leader of this particular group. And his famous opening lines of a poem, "I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree," caught the imagination not just of Ireland, but the world, and represented a movement back to simple things at a time when the modern movement was beginning. And it caught, as I say, it had resonance around the world. Ireland was suffering, as I said, from a severe lack of self-confidence. Next slide. And the fact that the British Prime Minister, who at the time technically was our Prime Minister, made it quite clear what he thought of us, will give you some indication of why action has to be taken. Now, if action is going to be taken, and if you want to correct your brand image, you obviously need a good advertising agency, because an advertising agency genuinely knows more about branding and how to correct images than anyone else. So we started off with a brilliant creative team. Next slide. The copywriter was Yeats. There's no doubt about it. It was his words throughout the century that captured the imagination and brilliantly portrayed Ireland. We also had a brilliant art director. Next slide. And this is Paul Henry. If you ask people around the world today to draw a picture of Ireland, they wouldn't draw a picture of the Google headquarters or the Amazon headquarters or anybody else's headquarters. They'd draw a pale imitation of a Paul Henry art, because that's what has established itself around the world as an image of Ireland. We also had an account planner. Next slide. Who came 30 years later. Now, if you're wondering why the account planner came 30 years after the creative team, you've obviously never worked in an ad agency. The account planner defined various aspects of the Irish personality and some unique characteristics of a capacity for thought in all sorts of opposite directions, mainly from an artistic point of view. The key point I want to make about this, and I suppose my only, because I have no scientific proof or any kind of market research proof, is that 100 years later, and we're talking now 2015 or 16, I took three comments about Ireland from three very different English commentators. Next slide. And the first was Simon Anhold, who knows a fair bit about nation branding. And I'm not going to read through that, but just have a quick flick through that slide. Next slide. This is from a left-wing perspective. Kate Soper is a left-wing British commentator. Next slide. And you may be more familiar with Lord Putnam, because after all, he did work in an advertising agency in London. And have a look at what he has to say. Now, there's a number of points to make about those three comments. First of all, they came 100 years after Yeats. But secondly, I think Yeats would be quite happy to agree with any of the three. And the other point is, of course, how coherent they are together. These people weren't at the same conference. I took these from totally different contexts, yet it represents, to my mind, a very coherent image. And that's why I think that the Irish nation brand image is coherent and powerful in today's world. Thank you. Over to you, JP, I think.
John, thank you very much for this great insight into the importance of nation branding and the Irish context. I'd like to start our discussion today in the area of measurement. As you pointed out, Ireland is a small country. It ranks 33rd in terms of GDP, and yet we consistently rank amongst the world's leading country brands. We rank 23rd in this 2021 BAV country study. So again, we punch above our weight. Question for you both, and I'll start with Mark. Which countries do we or should we benchmark ourselves against, and why?
Okay, thanks, Jane, and hello, everyone. Good evening. Who should we benchmark ourselves against? Well, 23rd isn't bad, and we often rank in the 20s or in the teens in sort of these global surveys. So, that's good form. But I noticed New Zealand was 4th, damn them. New Zealand, I suppose, similar sized country, what have they done right? Or actually I say 4th, I think they're in the top 10. But the point is, I would say from a tourism and a food branding perspective, they have a simplicity of message and they have a consistency of approach. So they have 100% New Zealand brand, which they have applied to both. They've applied for a very long time. You can go back 10 years in the textbooks of tourism marketing and they were the case study, and they're still using the brand. So I do think they have something to learn from in that approach. I said 4th, Switzerland were 4th. I think that's what it was. Who I think are pretty good as well in terms of consistent, probably more in the FDI and the tourism space. Pretty good, I think, at innovation. I think it's more the brand positioning than the branding that they're consistent in, but, pretty good. Innovative, although I do remember meeting the head of the Swiss Tourist Board about 3 or 4 years ago, and he said, I've studied your wide Atlantic way, and I'm going to copy that for Switzerland, and we're going to do it even better. So, hey, that's where they get some of their innovation from. But I do think, that, some of those countries that are similar size, punch above the weight, maybe Singapore also, it's a similar size country. I think they've done a good job of appealing West and East. And again, we might touch on this later, maybe, Crazy Rich Asians as a movie or as a series of books, watch it on Netflix. I think they did a good job of introducing them and building their brand image in the West. They leveraged that very deliberately, and it's given them a good kind of global image, which I think is something perhaps Ireland needs to do a bit more of.
Okay, so New Zealand, Switzerland and Singapore. John, your competitive set.
I would, if I was running the strategy, which of course I'm not, that's a political job, I would be inclined to align ourselves a bit more with the Nordic countries, particularly Finland. I'm quite interested in what they're doing, especially in the area of education, and Norway, Denmark and Sweden as well. I think the reason for that is, I think the world is moving towards their values. The neoliberal era is thankfully over. And that means that the Nordic countries are now much more in tune with the way I think the world is going than other countries. And I think that's a direction I would like to follow for Ireland. I don't think it's incompatible with anything in our existing image, but I just think we should be following that a little bit more.
Okay, well, talking about brand management, broadly speaking, one of the characteristics of our national brand management system is that it's not being managed centrally. Rather, it's managed through a sectoral approach, which it's fair to say has been enormously successful to date. Mark, could you give us some perspective on how this approach has worked historically and whether you think it's still fit for purpose?
Yeah, because I think a lot of countries that are coming new to nation branding think, we'll have the one brand, and it fits across everything and we'll all conform. Ireland, perhaps organically, has developed differently. Obviously the IDA was out early as a foreign, direct investment agency in the 50s. And, I think it developed over time. It's proof points. It's really more a sales brand. It's a bit more, obviously B2B. It's evolved over time, but it was out early with a sales message for Ireland. Tourism brand Ireland came in the mid-90s. So that was when the first cross-border activities generated a brand for the island of Ireland, funded by the EU. Originally, it was people, place and pace. Yes, in the mid-90s, we were a low-paced destination versus other places in Europe. That evolved pretty quickly as the Celtic Tiger came onto people, place, and culture. But people and place are still core to that. And, then when the food brand Ireland came along about 2010, again, it kind of leveraged some of that. And then Origin Green came in to build on that sustainability, that value of place. So I think they've kind of, built organically. I mean, yes, successfully. I mean, in terms of tourism, the World Economic Forum says we're the third best nation in the world at marketing and branding for tourists. The IDA has the #1 track record over the last decade for delivering high value jobs anywhere in the world. So it is working. There's some commonalities. So that place, that landscape works for Origin Green, and works for the food brand. It works for tourism. The people works for tourism in terms of welcome, probably works for the IDA in terms of skills. So there's something there. But, each of those, having a sectoral approach, if you like, has worked well for Ireland. Is it still fit for purpose? Well, I would say that the evidence is that it is, in that each of those sectors are still going strongly, COVID aside. The brand equity for each of those is still high or building. But like anything, perhaps becoming a bit more of a crowded landscape, as in, we've Enterprise Ireland now, we've got Culture Ireland, we've got Science Foundation Ireland, we've got Department of Foreign Affairs. So in one sense, even Ireland is becoming more international, and we could benefit probably from a bit of lane discipline and looking at synergies, like in the same way as Tourism Ireland would work with the Department of Foreign Affairs very much every St. Patrick's Day to turn the world green. Those sort of opportunities clearly come. But would we benefit from an overall nation brand? Well, John perhaps has a perspective on this.
John, time for change?
Yeah, I think it's there's a kind of tidy mind aspect to this. There's a tidy mind always wants to have a single kind of image over the running things. I'm not so sure. I'm inclined to agree with Mark. I think that for historical reasons, and I would go back much further for the tourist brand, much further than the 1990s. I think it started in the 1950s. And so did the IDA start in the 1950s. So the reason why they started was because Ireland was in a terrible position. In the 1950s, 3 out of every 4 people born in the 30s and 40s had emigrated. So we were there was a book called The Vanishing Irish. And the reason why these state bodies were set up at the time was out of desperation. However, they were luckily staffed by incredibly not just dedicated public servants, but entrepreneurial public servants. And so the IDA and the Tourist Board at the time and the Chorus Tráchtála, which would be now Enterprise Ireland, I suppose, were very successful. Although it might seem to the tidy mind of a management consultant looking for a fat fee to say it should all be kind of centralized, I would disagree with that. I think you'd be wrecking a very successful operation. That, however, I think there should be somewhere in some government department somebody looking at the image of, looking at the different aspects of the image of Ireland, looking at surveys like this, and making sure that there was some kind of coordination. I would suggest, however, if I can make a suggestion about the survey, it would probably be a help to run a parallel survey among opinion leaders, among the leaders of the media, business, administrative, and political in every country, because I think their opinion is very important for a country, for soft power for small countries. Whereas for the vast majority of citizens, they don't care too much about aspects of Ireland's image. I think it would be handy to know what the opinion leaders in different countries think of Ireland, because small countries need all kinds of favours from other countries in international organisations, and I think that's something we would benefit from.
Interesting refinement to the methodology, so thank you for that, John. We'll take that on board. Mark, you brought up the subject of culture and perceptions of culture. With the Celtic Revival as a primary creative influence, it's fair to say that perceptions of culture played a huge role in the earliest iterations of Brand Ireland. How important do you think these perceptions are today, and why?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, I mentioned how we moved Brand Ireland, Tourism Brand Ireland, on to include culture, from around the 2000s. But I suppose even when we do research today, let's say, as John is pointing out, with the general public in our target markets, what is culture for Ireland? Well, it's still U2 and it's Riverdance. I mean, that is the Irish cultural perception. Nothing wrong with that. Absolutely fantastic. We're building a U2 museum, and Riverdance still going strong 25 years later. So that's good. But I do remember presenting some research to the National Cultural Institutions about 4 or 5 years ago, who were absolutely disgusted that less than half of visitors actually went to museums when they came to Ireland. They couldn't believe we must be bringing in the wrong sort of people. But look, this is the point, right? Cultural, popular culture is what shapes the image of Ireland. That might have been poetry 100 years ago. Today, it's far more likely to be screen tourism, maybe, or perhaps music or literature in a modern sense. I mean, I would say we're an all-Ireland body. Game of Thrones helped change the image of Northern Ireland. I mean, when we were talking about Northern Ireland 10 years ago, we were talking about the Giant's Causeway, and then we had Titanic in 2012, and then Game of Thrones hot on the heels, and now there are 3 icons that are internationally recognised and we can associate with the place. So I think there is an opportunity to update, but it's very hard to plan for it, isn't it? We need a megastar, or we need a cohort to come through one particular art form or cultural form that will help shape the whole country image.
Thank you, John. Thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Mark again. Very hard to disagree with that. I think maybe there should be a little bit more initiatives to see, could we come up with some kind of TV series or film or more films that would catch the imagination of the world. Now, you can't dictate the process of art, but you can fund certain aspects of it a lot more than we do. I think it's fair to say theatre and writing is quite well funded in this country, although of course they would never agree themselves, but it is, and there's a huge body of Irish novelists. There's more writers per head in the country now than there ever has been. But I think film, particularly for television, and we've seen, again, I go back to the Nordic countries, have done quite well out of that. So I think we should probably encourage that a little bit more.
One final question for you both. What challenges do you see on the horizon for Brand Ireland, and what should we be doing about it? John?
Well, I'm taking a slight cue again from Mark here. I think that surveys, and I'm not as close to some of the surveys, I think the surveys would show that the image that I was talking about earlier is slipping a little bit among young people. And there's an obvious reason for that. Part of the image that was created for Ireland around the world was created by a diaspora who spread the word about Ireland's position in particular, and they were inclined to mope a little bit, but they attracted a lot of sympathy for Ireland. Among the younger immigrants, do not sit slobbering into their pints and mope about the desperate conditions they left behind. They're actually very self-confident, well-educated, and they left behind quite comfortable families and homes. So therefore, that aspect of our image building has dropped off in the last 30, 40 years, I suspect. And we need to look at how we can revitalise the Irish brand image for younger people.
Mark, thoughts on challenges?
Yeah, and I mean, building on what John is saying, so he's quite right. I mean, the research shows, that the brand image is stronger amongst older folk. But, of course, building on the diaspora theme, it's strongest in the Anglo-centric world. And going back to my Singapore example, that was great for the last century, when it was all US power. But in the next century, in this century, where, it's shifting towards Asia, I mean, my colleagues in China tell me, Ireland, Holland, and Iceland basically all sound the same in Mandarin. So, how do we distinguish the country? How do you build an image there? That is certainly an opportunity and challenge we need to succeed in. And, there's just that whole point. I mean, as John has said, you touched on the incongruity there, I suppose, of the old image with the modern reality, so you've got the survey showing we're on GDP per person, we're the richest country in the world. I mean, yes, it's GDP,
but just
but
add
still.
A point there, Mark. There is one aspect which I think we could push a little bit more. The most distinctive Irish cultural form is traditional music. That is generally acknowledged. The person who reinvented traditional music in Ireland in the 20th century was Sean O'Riordan. And I have a film clip of O'Riordan saying that traditional Irish music has much more in common with Eastern music than with Western music. It does not build to the sort of crescendo that the Western classical tradition exemplifies. It actually is very much in common with Eastern music. I think we could make more of that.
We need to win the Eurovision at least once more, John, as well.
No, please.
So Slipping cultural relevance and a need to boost our image in a younger demo sounds like an interesting brief for a communications agency. John Fanning, Mark Henry, thank you both very much on behalf of WPP for participating in this discussion today to mark the launch of the 2021 BAV Best Country Study. And thank you to our audience for tuning in. I'd like to invite you to stick around to taste a little bit of what Ireland has to offer. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much indeed.
We all done?
To celebrate this very special launch, we've created a very special app.
What is the video they're
It's
showing?
a virtual reality
Go on YouTube, you'll
experience
see it there now.
where you can literally visit
send you
every
the link.
single country
Okay.
that's featured in the 2021 study.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.
Well, you can get it on your desktop,
Thank you.
your
See you,
laptop,
Mark.
your
Very
tablet,
seamless.
your
Really
mobile
appreciate it.
phone.
Thank you.
All you need to do is just download
Keep it
it
up.
from the
Keep talking.
URL that's
Okay.
on the screen here. Enjoy,
Thanks,
explore. It's full of interest and insights, and we'll be refreshing the content frequently over the course of the next few months. So please do go back frequently. Well, thank you all very much indeed. To celebrate this very special launch, we've created a very special app. It's a virtual reality experience where you can literally visit every single country that's featured in the 2021 study. Well, you can get it on your desktop, your laptop, your tablet, your mobile phone. All you need to do is just download it from the URL that's on the screen here. Enjoy, explore. It's full of interest and insights, and we'll be refreshing the content frequently over the course of the next few months. So please do go back frequently. Earlier, I talked about the significance of countries being seen as brands. This is being increasingly realised right across the world, not just by business leaders, but by governments at the most senior of levels. I caught up with the Prime Minister of the Netherlands and asked him how important he believes country brands are. Mr. Prime Minister, what contribution do you think that retailing makes to the economy and society in general?
So many. I mean, it is the biggest employer in the Netherlands. 900,000 people are somehow connected to the retail sector, so it is huge in its economic impact. That means that many people, in many cases young people, start their working life experiences in the retail sector. It is also a place where you can learn how to be more entrepreneurial and how to start your own business. It is a sector in our economy which is very much focused on innovation and disruptive innovation. It is very much connected to the modern economy, to the internet, to online shopping. So there are so many positives. And it's also a place where people come together. It's also a sort of community place. In some of the stores, people drink a cup of coffee, meet friends, and then buy some stuff. So it has many, many impacts on society.
Mr. Prime Minister, you had a fantastic career at Unilever. You obviously know brands very well. Do you think country brands are as important as product brands?
Oh, they're crucial. And what I found in this job is that the brand of Amsterdam, the brand of the Netherlands, the brand of Eindhoven, or the whole commercial area around cities like Zwolle and Amersfoort are crucial for our international standing. And the fact that you can bike to school as a child, that it's relatively safe here, that there are so many possibilities when you like sports or culture. And I really learned to brand that much more than we did already.
One last question, Mr. Prime Minister. What advice would you give retailers today who are under a lot of pressure, under a lot of stress? Everything's changing very fast.
Yeah, but still, at the same time, you are in a fascinating sector. So enjoy what you are doing. We live only once. This is the real thing. This is not the. So you have to make the best of it. And there are so many opportunities for good salespeople, for good businessmen and women, to make use of all those opportunities which are out there, and do realize that you play a very important part in societies. You are really part of society.
Mr. Prime Minister, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Wow, I can't believe it. We've come to the end of our broadcast. We're almost out of time. I'd like to thank everybody who participated in today's broadcast. And just to remind you again, please do download the app and enjoy going virtually into every single one of our countries in this year's 2021 Best Countries Study. So from me, David Roth, thank you very much indeed. And Mike, thank you very much indeed as well.
My pleasure. And feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.
Well, have a great rest of the day. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. We really appreciate it.